Did you know there's a whole version of the Pacific Rim story that the two movies never told? There's an official comic book showing everything, and they even released a sequel in 2026 featuring a new Jaeger that nobody had seen before. So let's go, because today I'll tell you all about it. Hey my friend, I'm Gabriel. Everything alright? Today's video is about the expanded material for Pacific Rim, the official comics that fill in the gaps between Pacific Rim from 2013 and Pacific Rim Uprising, and which also show what came after. I'll tell you everything in chronological order, focusing on what the comics show, not what the movie has already shown, okay? Now, without further ado, let's get to the video. We'll start with the first official comic book of the franchise, Pacific Rim Tales from Year Zero, written by the film's screenwriter Travis Beacham and edited by Guillermo del Toro. This comic uses an interesting device. A journalist named Naomi Sokoloff is writing an article about the history of the Jaeger program and interviews three people who lived through the beginning of it all: Tendon Choi, the scientist Jasper Schoenfeld, and Stacker Pentecost himself. It's basically the founding document of Pacific Rim lore outside of the movies. And that's why practically all material released afterward treats its facts as the official reference. As the comic book shows, on the day the Kaiju trespasser attacks San Francisco, Tendo Choi recounts how he runs to rescue his grandfather in Chinatown, and his grandfather ends up dying from the toxicity of the Kaiju's blood, even though he survived the attack itself. And here's a piece of information the film never mentions. Stacker Pentecost had a sister named Luna Pentecost, a pilot in the British Royal Air Force. On the day of the attack, Luna was in the United States training other pilots, and she volunteers, along with her friend Tamsin Severe, to join the squadron that tries to stop the trespasser using conventional fighter jets. As the comic book itself shows, Luna doesn't survive this combat. She dies trying to contain the first Kaiju in history, even before any Jaeger existed to do that job. Tamsin Severe survives, and this detail will be important shortly. This information changes how you understand Stacker Pentecost from the movie. The weight he carries, that quiet and tough demeanor, has an explanation, right? He lost his sister to the war against the Kaiju even before it officially became a war. To explain a detail here, this comic was released alongside another material called Pacific Rim Man, Machines, and Monsters, a making of and visual concept book, also from 2013, which compiles the film's production designs. The difference is clear. Man, Machines, and Monsters is a technical reference without narrative. Tales from Year Zero is the comic that actually tells a story, and that's why it's the one that matters for reconstructing the chronology. According to interviews with Travis Beacham himself, at the time of its release, the intention was to show that nobody in the Pacific Rim story is a chosen one. They are ordinary people responding to a crisis in real time, and that's why the comic dedicates so much space to people who don't even get to pilot Jaegers like Luna. Still within Tales from Year Zero, the second interview in the comic is with scientist Jasper Schoenfeld, who recounts how the Jaeger program was born. According to the comic, the idea of building a giant robot piloted by humans came from him, but the technical problem, how to make a human mind control a machine of that size, was only solved by scientist Caitlin Lightcap, a former student of his. And this problem becomes clear in the test of the first Jaeger ever built, christened Brawler Yukon, a Mark-1 assembled on Kodiak Island, Alaska. In the first test, in January 2015, pilot Adam Casey tries to control Brawler Yukon alone and suffers a seizure that kills him. His body simply cannot handle the data load. Weeks later, in February 2015, it's Lieutenant Sergio D'Onofrio's turn to try, and the same thing starts to happen. He begins to convulse during the test. It is at this moment that Caitlin Lightcap makes a decision that changes everything. She takes a second Paul's helmet and mentally connects with Sergio, dividing the load between the two. As the comic shows, this is the first drift in history, created right there on the spot as an emergency solution. And it works. The test is validated, and the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps officially releases the Jaeger program. A few months later, in April 2015, a Kaiju named Karloff is detected approaching Vancouver, Canada. Since there were no other Jaegers ready for combat, the Brawler Yukon is sent, piloted by Caitlin Lightcap and Sergio D'Onofrio, and they win. This is, according to the comic book, the first Kaiju defeated by a Jaeger in the franchise's history. It's quite a milestone for a Jaeger that months earlier had killed its own test pilot. One detail that the comic makes very clear, and which often goes unnoticed: Caitlin Lightcap and Jasper Schoenfeld had a complicated personal history. They were teacher and student, had a relationship while he was still married, and rekindled it precisely during the development of the Jaeger program. It's this context that gives weight to the scene where Caitlin, after starting to drift with Sergio D'Onofrio, distances herself from Jasper. The comic shows that sharing your mind with another person, even if it's just to pilot a robot, changes the relationship you have with everyone around you. And it's this same emotional logic of drifting, established here in the first comic, that the first film uses years later to explain why compatibility between pilots matters as much as each one's technical skill. The third interview in Tales from Year Zero is with Stacker Pentecost himself, and it's here that the graphic novel connects his past with the present. After his sister's death, Stacker pursues a career within the Jaeger program and ends ends up partnering with Tamsin Severe, Luna's friend who survived the battle against the Trespasser. Together, the two become drift partners, sharing a common grief. They pilot the Coyote Tango, a Jaeger Mark-1, the same one the film briefly shows in a flashback when Stacker rescues little Mako Mori from the rubble of Tokyo. The movie already shows this scene, so I'll be quick here. A kaiju attacks Tokyo, Mako's parents die, and Stacker, still inside the Coyote Tango, finds the girl alone among the wreckage. What the comic adds is the reason behind his decision to adopt her. In his conversation with journalist Naomi, Stacker explains his worldview. For him, the war against the kaiju only makes sense if it's sustained by connection between people, not by revenge or fear. And it's this reasoning that underlies his choice to raise Mako as his daughter, even while piloting a Jaeger full-time in a war that seemed endless. Following Tales from Year Zero, Legendary Comics released a 4-issue miniseries in 2015 and 2016 called Pacific Rim: Tales from the Drift, written by Joshua Fielkov from an original story by Travis Beacham. Unlike the previous comic, this one isn't about characters you already know from the movie. It's about new people, new Jaegers, and new kaiju, covering a period of the war that the film simply skipped, but it remains a direct continuation of the previous comic. The main focus is on the couple Duke and Kaori Jessup, married pilots of the Jaeger Tauset Ronin. As the comic shows on June 21st, 2016, they face a kaiju called Itak in Tokyo Bay, and the fight ends badly. The kaiju's arm hits and pierces the Tauset Ronin, causing a radiation leak that floods the con pod and shuts down the Jaeger's electrical systems in the middle of combat. While this happens, the comic intersperses the scene with flashbacks of how Duke and Kaori met, one before the other, working on different sides of the same rift analysis mission. It's basically the origin story of a pilot couple that the film never mentions, but which was part of the PPDC's combat routine during the heaviest years of the war. Following the accident, according to the comic book, Duke and Kaori recover in a Tokyo hospital and receive a visit from none other than Stacker Pentecost and Mako Mori. Proof that, in the franchise's chronology, the two were already working together well before the first film began. The miniseries concludes by introducing a new Jaeger, the Victory Alpha, further expanding the list of machines we never saw on screen. Now comes one of the most important graphic novels for anyone who wants to truly understand Uprising. Pacific Rim: Aftermath, released in 6 issues throughout 2018, written by Cavan Scott. It takes place exactly 10 years after the end of the first film and the beginning of the second in Santa Monica in the year 2034. That is 1 year before the events of Uprising. As the comic book shows, after the breach is shut down and funding for the Jaeger program is cut, the world doesn't instantly become a safe place. In Santa Monica, a new generation of survivors emerges, living on the fringes of the law, including Joshua Griffin, a former Jaeger pilot who fell so low that he now pilots an illegal, scrap-built Jaeger enforcer for a local crime boss known as Mech Czar. In this same setting, Hannibal Chow reappears, and it is precisely here that the comic book introduces, for the first time, Jake Pentecost, Stacker's son, who arrives in Santa Monica seeking answers about his father's death, including rediscovering memories of Stacker's last drift through technology recovered from a Jaeger, in a scene that functions almost like a dive into the mind of the father he barely knew. This graphic novel is the missing link. It explains why Jake Pentecost, who at the beginning of Uprising appears as a carefree guy living off odd jobs in the black market, ends up in that exact state. The film only briefly suggests this. The graphic novel shows the complete origin of this downfall, and the final chapters of Aftermath further deepen Jake's downfall. According to the promotional material for the final issues of the miniseries, a group called the Kaiju Cult emerges in Santa Monica, formed by people who have come to worship the monsters themselves after years of war. And it is this group that pushes the conflict between Griffin, the Mech Czar, and Hannibal Chow to the climax of the story. In the midst of this, Jake revisits, within the drift itself, memories of rivalry with his adoptive sister, that is, with Mako Mori herself, and even reunites with his father within these shared memories, although the answers he receives are not exactly what he expected. It's a comic that humanizes Jake long before the opening scene of Uprising, showing his grief for his father in a way that the film simply didn't. Still within that same time frame, Legendary released another story in digital format in 2018 through the Webtoon platform called Pacific Rim Amara, written by Cavan Scott and Jong Ron, with art by Big Ann. Unlike Aftermath, this is the origin story of Amara Namani, the girl who Uprising already shows piloting her own homemade Jaeger, the Scrapper. As the comic book shows, Amara loses her family as a child in a kaiju attack that destroys her city and lives as a survivor until she is taken in by a difficult robot builder named Kai and his partner, Hannah. This makeshift trio gives Amara the tools, literally, to assemble her own Jaeger from recycled scrap parts, which explains why she already appears so mechanically adept at the beginning of Uprising. The film shows her piloting the Scrapper. The comic book shows how she learned to do it on her own. Here's an interesting production detail. Pacific Rim Amara was originally released in a vertical digital format, designed for mobile screens through the Line webtoon line, and only later became a hardcover print edition by Legendary Comics. And just as Aftermath does with Jake, Amara fulfills the function of giving you emotional context to root for a new character, even before she opens her mouth for the first time in Uprising. From here comes Pacific Rim Uprising from 2018, and you already know this because the film shows you Shao Industries' Jaeger drone program, Obsidian Fury, the final battle in Tokyo against the Mega Kaiju. I won't repeat what you've already seen on screen. What matters now is what comes after this point, and this is where the chronological story of the comics becomes interesting again, because the material that continues from here no longer had the cinema to tell its story, but rather the animated series Pacific Rim the Black, released in 2 seasons between 2021 and 2022, which takes place after the events of Uprising. The story follows siblings Taylor and Haley Travis, children of Jaeger Hunter Vertigo pilots, in an Australia that the PPDC abandoned after the Kaiju began attacking the continent at a frequency that the organization could no longer contain. But the focus I want to bring up here is on the comic book, because before this animation, Legendary released the comic book Pacific Rim Blackout in 2022, written by Cavan Scott, which serves as a direct prequel. It shows Hercules Herc Hansen, the pilot who survives the first film and loses his son Chuck in the final explosion of the Striker Eureka, now older and still in the field, trying to contain a growing wave of kaiju attacks in Australia, alongside his niece Olivia, co-pilot Cooper, and Marshall Rask. As the comic shows, Herc's own body begins to fail under the repeated strain of piloting and combat, leading command to remove him against his will. Shortly after, a sequence of attacks destroys several regional Jaegers at once. And according to the comic, even before sending the Jaegers into combat, Marshall Rask already identifies 2 of these new kaiju as Category 3 and a third as Category 4, which gives a real sense of the scale of the problem Australia was facing alone. Faced with this situation, the PPDC makes the most drastic decision possible: Operation Blackout, a total shutdown and evacuation of the entire remaining population of the continent. It is during this evacuation, according to the comic book, that tragedy strikes Cooper's own family, Herc's co-pilot, when their transport is destroyed amidst the chaos. This is exactly the scenario that the animated film The Black addresses. Why Taylor and Haley wait for their parents to return for 5 years, but that's an explanation for another video if you want. Comment here and I'll make it. And we've arrived at the most recent event to close out this timeline. In May 2026, Legendary Comics released the first volume of Pacific Rim Final Breach, written by Joshua Hale Fielkov, with art by E.J. Sue and Rebecca Goodout. A trilogy of graphic novels that the publisher itself describes as a direct official continuation of the 2 films, and no longer a parallel story filling in the gaps. According to the official synopsis released by Legendary, after years of failed attempts to enter the Antiverse, the dimension from which the Kaiju originate, Jaegers Pentecost and Herman Gottlieb devise a plan that depends on finding none other than Raleigh Beckett, the pilot of the Gypsy Danger from the first film and, according to the synopsis itself, the only person who has ever survived behind enemy lines within the Antiverse. Raleigh is living in isolation, far from the PPDC, and must decide whether to return to piloting alongside a new generation of Rangers. And the Jaeger used in this new mission has a name: Gypsy Destroyer, direct successor to the Gypsy Danger and the Gypsy Avenger, built using the same Kaiju Jaeger hybrid technology that Newton Geisler had secretly developed in Uprising, only this time turned against the precursors themselves in an attempt to open a path into the Antiverse once and for all. It's worth reiterating, since this comic is recent, it's still being released. Volume 1 came out in May of this year, and Volumes 2 and 3 are scheduled for release in 2026 and 2027, according to Legendary Comics' own announcement. In other words, the story of Pacific Rim didn't stop with the movies, nor did it stop with The Black. It's being written now, literally while you watch this video. And the cast of characters that Legendary showed in the first released pages reinforces this. In addition to Jaegers Pentecost, Herman Gottlieb, and Raleigh Beckett, the story also brings back Nate Lambert, now as an acting marshal, and Laiwen Shao, that businesswoman from Uprising, who was marked as the villain in the second film, but who is revealed here as a victim of Newton Geisler's manipulation. According to Legendary itself, the PPDC is using against the precursors the same Kaiju Jaeger hybrid technology that almost destroyed humanity in Uprising. Quite a choice, considering that this was exactly the type of technology that Obsidian Fury used internally. Leave a like and follow the channel. God bless you. A hug. See you later.